All right. Second half of tonight is going to be really much of the rest of the Vietnam War, so we left it really in the beginning of the big U.S. buildup. So we're going to go back in and talk about Vietnam and talk about a lot of the political and cultural dissent that caused and the major political movements, especially the anti-war movement in the 1960s and early 70s, and how that has even further effects on U.S. politics, especially at the presidential level. So this is going to get us into the early mid-1970s and the fall of Nixon. All right. So just to recap again, how American foreign policy leaders and military leaders were looking at Vietnam as important for not just U.S. power in Southeast or East Asia, but as symbolic of the larger Cold War. So U.S. leaders came to believe that the whole theory of containment, the whole idea of that was discussed and applied in the 1940s, starting usually in about 1947 or so, of really keeping the borders of communism where it is, especially around the Soviet Union, and allow the internal hypocrisies, especially the Soviet Union, to convince those peoples to rise up against their own government and win the Cold War that way. Popular protest against Soviet leadership, the Soviet dictatorship. And that seemed to be working, especially in Eastern Europe. They hadn't allowed communism to spread to Central or Western Europe very much. And that idea of containment had obviously been applied to, as we've talked about already, the rest of the world. Latin America, South America, places in Africa that we just haven't had time to talk about, much of the Middle East, South Asia, and in especially Vietnam's case, Southeast Asia. So the Johnson administration and U.S. foreign policy thinkers in general come to this belief that Vietnam is like the new major battleground of the Cold War, and that the United States cannot withdraw. They cannot leave Vietnam to, quote, go communist, because that would start the dominoes falling. If Vietnam goes communist, then its neighboring countries would go communist, like Cambodia or Laos. So you get a very strong series of statements from the Johnson administration, especially in 65 and going into 66. The United States will win this war against the northern communists in Vietnam. There's no doubt about it. It will just take some time and some, what the Johnson people call, investment. And of course, that usually means wholesale destruction of northern targets. Their fear is that if they allowed Vietnam to go communist, that the communist leaders of a unified Vietnam, or even of North Vietnam, will seek a military alliance with the Soviet Union. And it is not borne out by any amount of evidence that the northern leaders, even during the war, tried to create a close military relationship with the Soviet Union. Yes, they did take weapons from the Soviets and money from the Soviets, but it doesn't appear that they wanted to be Soviet puppets. They wanted their own country. So much of the northern movement is, again, a nationalist movement. They are a Vietnamese independence movement. And of course, they will take weapons and money from anyone who gives it to them to fight off what they view as an invasion from the United States. So from the Vietnamese perspective, they've been fighting their independence war, their revolutionary war, going all the way back to 1945-46, when they start fighting against the French. And the Americans are just the newest enemy. So a lot of the Johnson administration people very much failed to see the reality of what the North wanted to be. They did not want to be another country in the Soviet sphere, in the Soviet system. They wanted their own country. They did not want to join the worldwide communist movement to empower Moscow. And it takes, especially the guy in the video, McNamara, didn't realize that until the 1990s. So long after this stuff is over. And McNamara was one of the big strategists in fighting the Vietnam War. So many American leaders, not just the Johnson administration leaders, but many foreign policy analysts make that mistake. They just assume that the Northern communists wanted to ally themselves and sign on with the Soviets. One of the major problems of the war is that you don't just have the northern forces up in the north. They often take insurgent forces that dress up as civilians, and they go along through other countries and seep into southern population centers and even into the southern jungle. So a lot of the northern forces are looking to start an insurgency and are actively fighting the insurgency to topple the southern government to reunify the country under largely the northern leadership. So they often travel along the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, named after the big kind of revolutionary founder, that travels even into Cambodia. It travels outside of Vietnam itself, because they felt if they created their supply line in the neighboring country, then it wouldn't get bombed. Because under the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, President Johnson had the authority to bomb targets in Vietnam, but Congress never gave him the power to bomb other countries. So the northern forces that go into the south are literally kind of hit-and-run forces. They look to cause as much havoc and chaos as they can to try to create a popular kind of revolution against the southern government. So that's called guerrilla warfare, where you basically attack the enemy and then you go back into the hiding places. And Vietnam, just like it is today, is largely jungle, so there are a lot of places to hide. And that was the major problem for U.S. forces in Vietnam. They would sit at their bases, they'd get attacked, and when they went to strike back against the enemy would go off back into their hiding places, because they obviously knew the jungles well. This is their homeland. They build intricate underground tunnel networks to hide, even in some instances building tunnel networks underneath the U.S. bases. So eventually, U.S. strategy evolves, even within the first few weeks of the Marines landing in 1965, to not just sit on the base, but to actively take small contingents of soldiers and go into the jungles to try to find the enemy. And these were called platoons. So they take small groups of 15, 20, 30, go off into patrol into the jungle and try to find the enemy. And the theory is that once they find the enemy, they would call back to the Air Force base and have massive amounts of bombs dropped in that area to kill the enemy soldiers in their hiding places. So these became known as search and destroy missions, where they're literally leaving the bases and going off and searching, and once they find them, call it in back to the base and get the air support. Of course, many times, once the northern soldiers understood what was going on, they would set traps. They would find good places to ambush the American troops. So a lot of these turned into bloodbaths for the Americans. And there's obviously a lot of horrible stories back and forth of American soldiers being killed, sometimes being left behind. And since the American military didn't like losing their own soldiers, they often decided just to launch massive carpet bombing raids of entire areas of Vietnam to try to at least remove the forest, what they called deforestation. And they dropped gasoline-type bombs to start fires to burn down all forests so there'd be nowhere to hide. That's where a chemical called napalm came into play, or came into use. Play is not really a good word to describe this stuff. I mean, this turns into a slaughter. Another major problem for U.S. forces is that there's a lot of little villages in Vietnam, sometimes with only a couple hundred residents. And the so-called Viet Cong, which were a lot of northern forces that were in the south as insurgents, they would go to a lot of these small-scale little villages and demand food or demand young men to bring into their force. They basically draft Southern men into their basically rebel army, and it was impossible for civilians, just average farmers, to resist when the Viet Cong come in with machine guns. And of course, the Americans hear that the Viet Cong have moved into a certain area, so the American forces come in and try to, quote, cleanse or clear the Viet Cong from villages. But the Viet Cong dress like civilians very often, and they hide in the civilian population. So U.S. forces will enter a village. Sometimes it's an ambush. And U.S. forces sometimes end up killing a whole lot of innocent people in the village because they can't differentiate between enemy fighters and civilian farmers. So that leads to another series of bloodbaths, and in some instances entire villages are wiped out in American massacres of the Vietnamese, just kind of average daily farmers. There's several famous instances of that, where American troops were court-martialed for literally just lining up civilians and just machine gunning them. So there's obviously a lot of animosity and distrust on both sides. And there's a lot of Southerners, South Vietnamese people, who don't like their own government and actively support the insurgency. So they are domestic spies. And it's very hard for the Americans to tell who is who, because a lot of Americans go into this area not speaking Vietnamese, which is always a bad idea, right? If you're going to invade an area, you should at least be able to tell the cultural differences and be able to speak the languages, right? But that's a major mistake of Vietnam at that point. And when the home civilian population in the United States starts hearing about all these problems that the soldiers are having in Vietnam, and starts hearing about the massacres, and a lot of the U.S. soldiers are drafted, so they don't even want to be there. They're forced under threat of law. If they avoid the draft, they can be thrown in jail as traitors. So a lot of these guys literally didn't want to be there. A lot of them turned to alcohol and drugs to try to numb these experiences because they're absolutely horrific. And obviously the American troops didn't even bear the major brunt of the death and devastation that largely hit the Vietnamese population. So as much that did come back to the United States, much of the American population is outraged against this war. Many, even American foreign policy leaders, start coming out quickly and saying that this war is unjust, that it was, Johnson argues that he was given the permission to do this stuff by the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, but that's an iffy thing. A lot of politicians feel that they were tricked by Johnson. And a major U.S. foreign policy analyst, even George Kennan, who came up with the containment theory in the 40s, comes forward and publicly says that the United States should not be fighting in Vietnam, not just because of the morality of killing mass amounts of civilians and the embarrassment it's causing for the United States and the world, and the hypocrisy is pretty clear. They're saying they're fighting for freedom when all these massacres are going on. But Kennan specifically says that Vietnam was not worth fighting over. Vietnam did not have industry, it did not have a giant population, it did not have nuclear weapons, it did not have an advanced army. It was basically a 1700s society. It was a farming-based society, and Kennan said it's not worth fighting over. If the communists are going to take it over, let them have it. Kennan was interested in centers of worldwide power. And he said as early as, I believe, 1948, that the only place worth holding in all of East Asia was Japan. And the United States already had that, controlled Japan very closely. So Kennan's theory was that Vietnam just wasn't economically or militarily worth the investment that the United States was making in retaining control. So there's several foreign policy leaders who made similar statements. And that, along with a lot of the public outrage, starts a massive anti-war protest movement that gets going as early as the spring of 1965, right when the first Marines are landing in the South. So there's an immediate anti-war movement. It's small at first, but as the atrocities grow and as the complaint of soldiers grow and the draft dodging grows, this movement grows in the popular mind and becomes a major political force in and of itself. Their two major accusations are, number one, on the high-level foreign policy worldwide Cold War idea that Vietnam is not worth fighting for in the worldwide Cold War. And there's also a lot of internal political complaint about U.S. politics. That basically U.S. politics are dominated by the rich. That they're the ones who spend money to win elections. They get their friends into office. And the U.S. military buys its guns and bombs from somewhere. And they buy them from U.S. companies. So those companies have an investment in war going on, right? Because if the U.S. only needs, say, 200,000 bombs, once they get to that quota, they'll stop buying, right? So how do you make sure they keep buying? Convince them to keep using bombs somewhere. So there's even a major political theory today. When's the last time the United States has not been bombing someplace in the world? Nothing I can think of in the past 20 years. But that's a major theory, that these arms companies make so much money off of these wars that they can take some of that money and win presidential elections and then, therefore, determine foreign policy. Does that make sense?
When you say Vietnam was not important, what do you mean? Like, when
to people like Kennan, and Kennan said this literally in one paper that he wrote. He said there are 5 sources of world power, 5 areas of the world that are important if you want to be a powerful country in the world, or to control the world. And he said that these are the intersections of military power with industry and economic strength, technologically advanced societies usually. One of them is the United States. One of them is Great Britain. One of them is Germany. One is the Western Soviet Union. And one is Japan. So you have 5 of them. Kennan says that those are the 5 areas you should be concerned with retaining control over. Any other areas aren't as important. So Kennan said, Vietnam, who cares? And in one paper he specifically said that the U.S., its only interest in Southeast Asia is military, basically, and it's not much of an interest. So, who cares who rules over these people? He even said the same thing about China. They don't have much industry or much technological advancement at that point. So, if the Soviets want to take control, let them. It's just going to weaken the Soviets because they're going to have to spend all that money taking and keeping control. That's the basic theory. It's not a very humanitarian theory, right? These guys aren't concerned with the quality of human life in different places of the world. They're interested in control. And that's their policy. And it still is today. There's not much doubt about that. The United States views certain areas as very valuable to control, and other areas as less valuable. So the U.S. often doesn't care about famine or genocide in Central Africa, right? Other questions? Okay. At this point, especially when Vietnam really gets going and they need eventually hundreds of thousands of troops, there is a draft, and there had been a draft for many, many years, going back into the late 40s by this point. The draft had kind of gone away after World War II, but came back very quickly when the Cold War starts building up. U.S. believes it has to have a lot of soldiers on hand to fight in case need be. So the draft had ramped back up in the late 40s, early 50s, and had continued at low levels. Elvis Presley was drafted in like 1957, so he went into the army. But the draft really ramps up because they need hundreds of thousands more soldiers to fight in Vietnam. And a lot of drafted young men refuse to go, especially in California, where it's estimated by 1968, I think it's 2/3 of the drafted men in California refused to show up. Many of them go to jail. Many of them go to Canada. And many of them just hide in the society until they get caught. They said they were unwilling to be forced into an army to go off to some place and fight a war they didn't believe in against poor people. And so a big thing in the 60s was to take your draft card and burn it, or take your notice of a draft that you were going to be drafted. They'd send you a letter in the mail and literally burn it in public, which was a crime, which people would serve jail terms for. And some of these terms could be very long, 10, 15 years. And of course, the conservatives who come out and say, the war is justified, that everything we're doing is okay, accuse these guys of being unpatriotic, they're stabbing their country in the back and whatnot. So the draft becomes, especially on college campuses, because it's where a lot of, early 20s, late teens young men are, the draft becomes hugely unpopular, and you have massive anti-war protests growing, especially at Berkeley, as one of the first centers of it in California, at least. But it spreads nationwide very quickly. One way that the Johnson administration tried to subdue the complaint against the draft was to exempt the middle class from it as much as possible. Deferments were given for several classes of people, especially if you were the children of leading politicians. If you were the child of a congressman or a senator, then you were exempt from the draft. So it literally means the Senate is voting to go to war and not willing to send its own children to go fight. Another thing, if you could supply some kind of doctor's note that said that you were physically incapable of running and jumping and doing all that stuff, then you could get out of the draft. Also, if you are a college student in good standing, you could get out of the draft. You got an exemption for being in college, which has a couple natural implications. Number one, we get a thing in the 60s and 70s called grade inflation, which basically means all the students that would be failing a class, the professors start giving D's and C's to. Because the professors know if the student flunks out, they're getting drafted, and I could have a deep hand in this person being killed. So a lot of professors literally refuse to flunk students. So the students that would have gotten F's now get C's. Of course, the students who had gotten C's now get B's, and the B's get A's, and the A's get a perfect grade. And so there's a lot of complaint about that amongst the universities, especially that they're getting too soft on the grades. But a lot of professors literally rebelled and didn't want to take part in this kind of stuff. Another natural result of all these exemptions is who does the Army eventually get built out of? Who goes into the Army? Non-college educated. People have no political connections. Which basically means the poor and the wage workers. The non-professional classes. The kind of average factory workers and farmers. And that was seen as a very deep problem in the United States, this inequality that the rich are voting to go to war and they're not sending their children to war. But the poor, who are usually outvoted in war just by the spending of money, their children are the ones that are being sacrificed. And one person who pointed this out very clearly was Martin Luther King. He was already worldwide famous for his nonviolent equality protests, or segregation protests, or whatever you want to call them, integration protests. So he had been doing that for over 10 years by this point. And in April '67, he gives a very powerful speech in New York, where he says that the Vietnam War is a problem not just for U.S. foreign policy, but for U.S. society. He sees, at this point, he says, I have mostly been silent on foreign policy for the United States. I've been focused on the civil rights movement. But he says there's now a combination. Because black men in the United States at that point only represented 4 or 5% of the U.S. population, but were taking 25% of the Vietnam soldier deaths. So there's a vast difference. That's the direct result of inequality and poverty. And he said that the only way for the U.S. to overcome this moral catastrophe is to rebuild equality in the United States and stop the slaughter in Vietnam. And he defined it as a slaughter. So he drew a very close connection between what he called racism, militarism, and what he called the consumer society. The society that's more interested in buying things, buying the newest computer or the newest phone or the newest car, rather than being concerned with equality and brotherhood across the world. And very quickly after making these statements, he's assassinated. He went on for many years just leading a domestic civil rights movement, but when he started criticizing the U.S. government in a worldwide scope and compared them to the dictators of the Soviet Union, he was eliminated very quickly afterward. So questions about that? Okay, now there's another group. There's a giant counterculture movement that erupts in the 60s. Mostly by about 66, and then starts to grow very, very quickly. This movement, at least its early leaders, were connected to the beat movement of the 1950s that complained about consumer society and obsession with wealth and sameness in the 50s. And a lot of the early leaders in this new counterculture movement, as it kind of evolves into something much more dramatic, literally say they're going to drop out of U.S. society. If they get drafted, they're not going to go. At least the first leaders are college educated. So a lot of this anti-government feeling, this feeling that the youth have to take the country back and save its morality and save its future, is a very powerful idea in the 60s. So they reject the suit and ties of their fathers and their uncles and whatnot, and they start dressing in vastly different ways, usually very colorful ways to proclaim their personal independence, and eventually become labeled the hippie generation, which is a derisive term, a term used to make fun of them. And because it is often seen as a very fun and cool thing to do, to rebel against the prevailing powers of the world, the counterculture movement grows not just on campuses, but throughout culture in general. Whereas you get these kind of images of the most rebellious rock stars of the late 50s and early 60s, that mostly sang kind of love songs about their girlfriend or something. And the Beatles are a good example of this. Whoops. The Beatles very quickly changed from singing about how much they want to hold their girlfriend's hand to talking about Eastern meditation philosophy, to talking about communism, socialism, the feeling that there has to be equality, that everybody's in it together, and that people have to help each other, and that the government's not really interested in that stuff. That governments are interested in power. And they changed very, very quickly. Stopped going on tour, stopped caring about really making much money for themselves. They are already fabulously rich by that point anyway, so it wasn't a concern. So got involved in drugs and got very creative with music. And if you listen to the later Beatles albums, they're very different even from each other. They start publishing 2 or 3 albums a year. And you very quickly go from the Beatles on the left, their early kind of selves, and they change very quickly. And you can see it just in the way they dress and the way they look. They became much more individualistic. So questions about that or how they represented it.
Was it mostly Bob Dylan regarding all that stuff?
Yeah. Bob Dylan was one of them. Bob Dylan was singing about social criticism and the failures of government as far back as even the mid-50s. And reportedly he made contact, especially with the main songwriters in the Beatles, and convinced them that the Beatles were famous enough to really make a social difference. That if they start singing about important things, they could they'll probably lose a lot of their audience who just want to have happy tunes to hum to, but sing in the car or whatnot. But they made the transition to much deeper social criticism, and there's a lot of stories that Bob Dylan introduced them to that idea that they have a massive microphone and they're really wasting the opportunity if they don't take some kind of action. And this seeps into all kinds of different culture because it's a big moneymaker. The Beatles albums were the number one selling, even compared to today, of all time. They made huge amounts of money. So, of course, studios copy that idea, as companies often do. When they find something that sells a lot, they remake it over and over and over again, right? That's why you've got 22 Saw movies, or however they made. Once they find something that makes money, they will reproduce it and try to suck as much money out of it as they possibly can. That's what companies do. So when you start getting kind of very radical, different oriented types of movies and television shows, they start getting basically cloned by the companies that they see an audience for it, they want to make money off it. One of the biggest movies of the 60s was called Easy Rider and was made very cheaply. The motorcycle guy on the right was actually the writer and director of the whole thing. Made it very cheaply. It's basically a story of these guys on motorcycles traveling across the country and coming into contact with different peoples and talking and whatnot. It was a kind of paranormal activity of back then. And of course, you know what happens when one of those makes millions and millions of dollars? All the other companies come out with their own kind of story, right? They start giving funding to small-time directors to make the same kind of movie over and over again because they see a market for it. And they, just released a 5th or 6th Paranormal Activity, right? They're still making money off you for watching basically the same story, right? But Easy Rider especially had a lot of very critical things to say about U.S. society, so I'll play a clip from that on the idea of freedom and how the Americans say that they're all about freedom, but when it comes down to real freedom, a lot of Americans reject it. The freedom to truly do what you want as an individual. So that guy's point is a lot of people like to believe they're free, even as they go to work day after day at a job they hate just in order to make enough money to barely survive or own a bunch of stuff that they don't really need. So that's the criticism of the idea of freedom. And he says, it's easy to proclaim that you're free when you're actually bought. You're someone's employee. And you have bills to pay. I mean, you could just stop paying your bills, right? And you could just go get a tent and live somewhere, or you could go get a motorcycle and go somewhere else and have a different experience. But that's scary to a lot of people, right? But that's real freedom, to completely separate yourself from all these other somewhat meaningless responsibilities and actually go off and do what you actually want to do. But that's a problem in our society, I would think. Or unless you guys all like your jobs. Some of us actually do like our jobs. And get to sit around and think about these things all day long. But okay. This is generally the problem of the culture industry, though. Once one movie makes it big, or one kind of sound makes it big on the radio, and they start selling a lot and making a lot of money, that instantly gets copied, right? And it gets mass-produced. And what happens to something that was special that gets mass-produced?
It's not special.
Yeah, it's not special because now you have everything the same again. That's what philosophers call the culture industry, is the mass production of one individual's creativity, the mass copying of it to make money. And once you have that going on, it's not really all that creative anymore because it's copied so much. It's not special. It's not a big statement anymore. And you can see that constantly happen, especially today, where it's going faster and faster. There's all new kinds of attempts at creating new genres of music and movies and whatnot in order to be different. And once artists realize that they can make money off of being different, they start doing more and more extreme things to be different, right? And the problem of the hippies, and largely many of the problems of today's media society, is that you start getting leaders in the media that have to do so extreme things that they get disconnected from the criticism or the politics of the moment. They become more just symbolic acts of rebellion rather than real statements or real criticism. And of course, consumerism keeps driving faster and faster to convince people to buy more and more stuff, and one of the ways they do that is to make you feel ashamed for owning old stuff. So it's the constant demand to buy the newest thing. And I found this picture just 4 years ago to represent this, or 3 years ago, or something like that. And this is already hugely outdated, right? But those are two of the big symbols I find of culture industry today. It's pretty disgusting in a lot of ways. So, something to think about. Questions about any of those? But that's one of the problems of also the hippie movement in the 60s, or what came to be called the hippie movement, is that their leaders got increasingly extreme to the point where they got really separated from their original government criticism. Especially when things get very violent in 1968. 1968 historically is known as one of the most violent and turbulent years in U.S. history. So there's several instances, several things I want to talk about really quickly. Number one is an offensive launched by the North Vietnamese against many different southern targets, all in the last few days of January 1968. Tet is a major kind of cultural and religious holiday in that part of the world. So the Americans and the South Vietnamese figured that the insurgents would basically observe the holiday and not launch any attacks, and they did the exact opposite. They launched a wave of massive attacks against many major targets, including the American embassy in Saigon. This turned into be a massive military defeat for the communist forces. They lost an estimated 100,000 troops in this wave of attacks. So it was a military debacle, but it was symbolically very successful, because this is the point where many in the American media and many in American society begin to feel that the United States cannot win in Vietnam. That as many people as you kill, as many of the enemy soldiers, no matter what the kill ratio, the kill margins are, they're going to keep coming back. They're not going to give up. So especially Walter Cronkite, probably the most famous news reporter in the United States, in talking about the Tet Offensive, says on air that Vietnam is looking like a hopeless stalemate. And he was seen as one of the more trusted kind of analysts in the country amongst the general population. So a lot of people begin to agree with him, and there's begin to be major calls for winding down the war in Vietnam, if not ending it completely. President Johnson goes on television in late March of 1968. This is his re-election year. He's only served one term, right? He was elected in '64. And he announces that he is going to change policy in Vietnam. He's going to start winding it down and removing large amounts of U.S. troops from South Vietnam. And he's going to open negotiations with the North. And he also announces on television that he will not run for another term as president. So the presidential race is thrown wide open. One of the major problems for the Americans in the war is that the American media went into Vietnam. And they went in with new television camera technology, and they were able to get literally live images of people dying in Vietnam, and they broadcast that into American living rooms. And that tended to outrage and disgust a whole lot of American voters. And Johnson's advisors kept telling him to send more and more troops into Vietnam. And by late '67, early '68, he seems to have realized that that wasn't working and that there's no way out for him. He was becoming so unpopular that it was becoming predicted that he would not win re-election. So he decided to retire at the end of the year. And that's a very famous picture of him at his kind of war cabinet meetings. After they've all left the room and thought they gave him good advice, he's looking at this with great despair. And one of the sad things about Johnson is that he had a lot of very powerful domestic programs, but most Americans remember him for Vietnam more than the major accomplishments he created for U.S. society. But these are the kinds of images that got broadcast, and this is just a still image of a video of a suspected communist spy being shot in the South. And, not much of a trial or anything, just took him out of the jail and shot him. So Johnson is knocked out. Just a few days later, King is assassinated in, I believe it's Memphis. And that causes outrage, even further outrage. There's a lot of suspicions that the U.S. government has killed him, that there's a conspiracy amongst the U.S. government to assassinate King, because he had come out and literally a year before, to the day, had given that speech criticizing U.S. foreign policy. So there are a lot of accusations even today that the U.S. government was involved in the assassination somehow. The black population in the United States is obviously outraged. Malcolm X had been killed a few years earlier. Medgar Evers and others have been assassinated. And these are major names in the civil rights movements. So King was the peak of the outrage, and so there are many riots, even in Los Angeles, throughout the United States, and even in Washington, D.C. itself. The U.S. Army has to march out and defend the Capitol building where Congress meets. So the U.S. military is forced to defend its government buildings against its own people in a lot of instances. When Johnson announced he wasn't going to run for re-election, John F. Kennedy's younger brother, Robert, appeared to be the next in line, the next most popular candidate. Kennedy was a senator from New York at that point. It really seemed to be coming down between, on the Democratic Party side, Kennedy and Johnson's vice president named Humphrey. So the primary votes start being held in spring '68. Kennedy wins quite a few of them. And on the night he wins the one in California, he himself is also assassinated. So that's somewhere in mid-June or so. And just like John F. Kennedy's assassination, there's immediate fears and worries that there's a large conspiracy and that the U.S. government itself may be behind it. So once Robert Kennedy is killed, and Robert Kennedy appeared to be much more of a kind of domestic policy liberal in the way of Johnson than even his older brother was. The Democrats meet in Chicago that year to nominate their presidential candidate, who does become Humphrey, and have their national convention. Riots break out outside the convention in Chicago. So they are literally having the convention and having this Democratic Party unity and whatnot going on inside, or at least they hope. And literally on the outside of those walls, there are riots going on. The Chicago police come out in force in riot gear and start literally beating almost anyone they can possibly lay their hands on, political activists and anti-war protesters and whatnot. So these are the dominant images of the convention, and even some of the politicians inside the convention said that these were, quote, Gestapo tactics to silence the dissent. So the Democratic Party is divided and gets a very bad reputation. They were seen as Johnson's party, the one who started the war, and had started a lot of these major international problems and seemed incapable of fixing it. The Republican Party was really unified under Richard Nixon. So when the vote eventually happens in November, largely between Nixon, the Republican, and Humphrey, the Democrat, Nixon tends to win overwhelmingly. Humphrey takes most of the northeastern states. He was from Minnesota. and Johnson was from Texas, so Texas went with the Democrats again. But even in this instance, the southern states that don't trust Nixon, because he's a political moderate, he's not one of these kind of rabid segregationist types, so the southerners don't really want to vote for him, so they vote for a third-party candidate named Wallace, who advertised himself as being a pro-segregationist. His line is, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So the southern states deny Nixon and the Democratic Party their vote. So again, the southern states are turning against the Democratic Party in complaint of what Johnson and the Kennedys had done for civil rights. And in doing that, Nixon is able to win the election fairly easily. So Nixon will go into the presidency in January 1969. So questions about that at all? Nixon is not the most trustworthy candidate or politician ever. He had promised throughout the campaign in '68 that he had a, quote, secret plan to end the war. It appears he had no secret plan. When he actually gets into office, he immediately starts making changes, what he says are changes, which are basically the same old policy, which is to bomb North Vietnam, to force them to the negotiating table, basically destroy everything worth bombing in the North in order to basically force the Northern leaders to need an end to the war. And at the same time to build up the South Vietnamese army, which is a long-term standing policy going all the way back to the 50s under Eisenhower. Nixon's grand vision is to convince the Northerners to negotiate an end to the war, at the same time take U.S. troops out, because that was the source of the U.S. anti-war movement, and on the third level, at the same time, build up the South Vietnamese army to be able to fight off the Northern invasion. And he called this process Vietnamization. So it becomes very obvious that once he gets into office, he didn't really have a secret plan. He just basically continues the same old policies that have been pretty much ineffective up to that point. Sound familiar at all? Bomb the enemy into the Stone Age, build up the domestic force in that area, and try to pull the U.S. troops out. Yeah, these things have been tried and failed very clearly in other places and much more recently. And eventually he announces a foreign policy that eventually becomes known as the Nixon Doctrine, which is literally the United States will give money and weapons to any government fighting communist invasion, subversion, or fighting communism in general, but will not send U.S. troops. He doesn't want to send U.S. troops into other places because that creates the anti-war movement. So he has to figure out a way to continue fighting these kinds of battles. He just wants to do it more strategically, and he wants to really pull the rug out from under the anti-war movement in general. And under his administration, they start decreasing the draft and try to start coming up with ways of fighting these kinds of wars into the far future. They're not giving up on fighting these wars, but to do it with a volunteer army, which is what the United States has today, right? There is no draft in the United States that's ongoing. It's on the books legally, but it's not happening. The U.S. military is an entirely volunteer force. Nixon, though, has other problems. Nixon's large-scale bombing of the North was not enough to force the Northerners to give up. And Nixon seemed to know it. So Nixon takes the gamble of not only bombing the Northern industry and all the kind of sources of all this material getting into the South to fight, he then takes the decision to bomb the actual Ho Chi Minh Trail itself, which is hugely problematic because lots of that trail are not in Vietnam. They're in the neighboring countries. And this is a dangerous thing for Nixon because at this point, these are secret bombings. He wants to do it quickly, overwhelmingly, to destroy the supply lines, but he wants to keep it secret. How can you bomb this much territory at that kind of scale and keep it secret? That's an open question. But this is illegal. The president doesn't have the authority to do this. So if the U.S. press or the U.S. population or Congress ever find out about this stuff, Nixon can be removed for crimes against the Constitution, going to war without any kind of declaration or permission, going to war basically against these neighboring countries by bombing them. Inevitably, word starts to leak that Nixon is doing these things, and he gets very mad. At the same time, in 1971, an internal worker analyst in the Pentagon starts making copies of an internal document that had analyzed. When Nixon came into office, the administration ordered an analysis of the whole history of the Vietnam War from 1945. That analysis was performed. One of the guys that had access to this thing read it and understood its importance because it's basically revealing that Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and now Nixon had all blatantly lied to the American people. All those presidents have said, we don't want to fight this war, we're not going to get involved, even while they're planning to get increasingly involved. And they are doing so. So this analyst in the Pentagon goes to his Xerox machine and starts running off copies of this thing and sneaks it out of the Pentagon and eventually gets it published in American newspapers. These become known as the Pentagon Papers, which literally reveal that American politicians have lied to the public. And Nixon is pissed. Nixon says that there are internal leaks in the Pentagon, and he becomes very paranoid about even the people working around him. So he has people in his administration and ex-CIA officers create an enemies list of potential sources of these leaks. And so he directs the CIA, the FBI, and even the IRS to investigate the people on this list secretly. And that's also against the law because the CIA is not supposed to operate, not supposed to run domestic spy systems. CIA is created to run spy networks in other countries. So that's illegal also. And when that stuff starts getting leaked also to the press, he creates an elite group of what he calls plumbers, because what do plumbers do? They fix leaks. So these plumbers were literally enforcers. They would go to anyone suspected of leaking information to the press and threaten them with destruction of their careers, auditing by the IRS, getting thrown in jail by the FBI. I mean, this has a lot of different sources. And there are some rumors of threatened assassination. So all this is hugely illegal, and it has to be kept secret. One of these plumber groups breaks into the Democratic National Headquarters in Washington, D.C., one of their kind of offices in Washington, during the president's re-election in 1972. Nixon was elected in 68. He's up for re-election in 72. Nixon, by this point, is so paranoid that he is using these plumber groups to gain any kind of embarrassing information on famous Democrats. And burglarized secret files at the Democratic Party headquarters in Washington. Problem is that some of those burglars were caught in the office building. So they're caught red-handed with their hands in the files. So they're arrested for breaking and entering, burglary. And they're going to go on trial. Nixon is desperate to keep them quiet, because he knows if they start talking about who would hire them, where the money is coming from, and what they're actually doing there, then they can implicate Nixon and his lieutenants. So we now know that Nixon knew about the break-in and the problem within 48 hours. And Nixon ordered the cover-up to begin. Basically, give these guys that are in jail, these burglars, promises of a huge amount of money if they just go to jail for a few years, serve their 5, 6, 10-year term in jail for burglary, and once they get out, they're going to get paid. So they never have to worry about money again. That's hugely illegal. That's tampering with witnesses and obstruction of justice. Congress, eventually one of the burglars testifies and names one of the Nixon officials as the guy who was giving orders. Congress launches an investigation. The Democrats now have a majority in Congress, or they've always had a majority in Congress ever since the 40s, basically. So they want to knock Nixon out. They start having congressional hearings where literally they bring in one Nixon advisor after another to testify about what they knew about the Watergate break-in. And one after another, they say absolutely nothing. Because they're being threatened also. And they're also being told that, if they have to go to jail, they'll be paid also. So Congress lines up all these witnesses. They get almost no information until they eventually get to a second level guy named Butterfield, who comes in and testifies and gives this shocking testimony that Nixon actually tape records everything that goes on in the Oval Office, the president's office. He tape records all of his conversations for his presidential library. And now Congress says, all we have to do is get copies of the tapes on certain days, and we got them. Congress officially asked Nixon to turn over the tapes. Nixon knows he's guilty, so he's not interested in that. So Congress sues Nixon to get the tapes. Nixon appoints an independent special prosecutor to run these investigations, which is something that presidents often do to handle scandals. The president can stand up and say, I'm innocent, and to prove it, I'll actually allow someone in my office to run the investigation. I'm not going to mess with them. They can do whatever they want. Therefore, I have nothing to hide. When the Senate and the special prosecutor subpoena the tapes, and it goes through the court system all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will eventually decide that Nixon has to turn it over, Nixon goes to the Attorney General, the highest lawyer, the government's highest lawyer, and orders the Attorney General to fire the special prosecutor, because the special prosecutor is now learning too much. He was too good at his job. The Attorney General refuses. So Nixon fires the Attorney General. Brings in the next guy. Says, guess what? Now you're Attorney General. Fire the special prosecutor. That guy refuses. You're fired as Attorney General. Brings in the next guy. Goes through several Attorney Generals in one night. And finally gets to a guy who will fire the special prosecutor. This becomes known in U.S. culture as the Saturday Night Massacre. And this is where the U.S. public turns against him. And even the Republican Party. Because there's no reason for him to do this. Unless he's guilty, right? And this is where the U.S. public starts to view him very suspiciously. And at that point, it's really over for him. He is forced, the Supreme Court intervenes and forces him to turn over the tapes. When he turns them over, some of the most important parts of the tapes are, quote, accidentally deleted. So no one trusts him for that either. And even with what was on the tapes, Congress had enough to impeach him. And in July they do. The House of Representatives votes 3 articles of impeachment, which are literally formal accusations that the president has committed crimes and must go on trial. The trial will be held in the Senate. And one of the tapes literally proves, again, that Nixon knew about the break-in and helped order the cover-up, the intimidation and the giving of money within 48 hours. So one of the tapes, on literally what was left of the tape, proved him guilty. And proved that he had been lying about this for going on 2 years. And Republicans then even joined in voting for these impeachment articles, and that appears to be where Nixon also decided that it's over for him. If he went to trial, in any impeachment trial, there's been 2 of them in U.S. history, the Senate has to vote by a 2/3 majority to find the president guilty and remove him from office. The theory was that the Republicans had enough senators that the Democrats alone couldn't get the 2/3. But now Republicans are turning against him, and it looks like they're going to convict him also. So Nixon decides to resign instead of face the trial itself. His resignation will, when he leaves office, will promote the vice president to the presidency. The day before he resigns, he has an hour-and-a-half meeting with Vice President Ford. And neither of them really talked much about what went on at the meeting. But it appears some kind of deal was struck between Nixon and Ford, where Nixon offered to resign and make Ford president if Ford would pardon Nixon personally for all crimes that he may have committed regarding the Watergate scandal. And it appears that some kind of deal was struck. Nixon announces his resignation on the night of August 8th and leaves office noon the next day, gets on a helicopter, flies away, flies off into retirement. So that's where you get President Ford. A peace treaty with Vietnam had been signed, but the war still went on. There was still smaller scale fighting. I don't want to say small scale. It's still pretty destructive. So it really falls to Ford to oversee the final removal of U.S. forces and the final creation of peace in Vietnam. But Watergate is famous for a lot of reasons. Watergate was a giant test of the U.S. Constitution because it had the most powerful politician, the president, involved in one of the biggest scandals. It was an attempt by the president to hide information from the public, and information that proved that the president was guilty of crimes, largely going to war without permission against certain countries that would have demanded the removal of the president. Number 2, the president used the U.S. federal government to investigate political enemies, Democrats and people he didn't trust, newspaper reporters and whatnot. So he literally used the CIA, the FBI, the IRS, and a lot of other bodies to investigate people that he thought were his own personal enemies that were trying to drag him down. And then there's, again, another constitutional question of separation of powers, where the president is supposed to enforce the laws and run foreign policy, and Congress passes laws and runs congressional investigations. And Nixon was trying to stop those investigations through intimidating witnesses, through bribery, eventually through going to court to defend release of the tapes, to stop release of the tapes. So there's constitutional questions all over the place for Watergate. And eventually the American public came to recognize this and turned against Nixon. And he went off into a very shameful retirement. And he doesn't give interviews or anything for a long time. He is completely out of politics. But it does fall to President Ford to end the Vietnam War once and for all. Once the final U.S. troops leave South Vietnam, the northern invasion just overruns the South Vietnamese army, and reunifies the country under communism. And that's largely where it is today. The country's changed and taken in more capitalism and investment and whatnot, but most communist countries have. So we'll get to those kinds of ideas later. So questions about anything with Nixon or Vietnam in general?
So did President Ford grant him? Did he?
Yes, Ford went on television very quickly and gave Nixon amnesty, which is a constitutional power that the president has. The president can pardon any individual for any crime. These mass serial killers that go off and kill 80 people and eat their livers or some damn thing. The president has the power to pardon them and release them from jail if the president wants. It's a very big, very wide-ranging power. Doesn't get used very often. But Ford did pardon Nixon, and Ford also pardoned, now that the war is over, Ford pardoned all the draft dodgers from the United States. So they were all, if they were in jail, they were released. A lot of them had gone to Canada, so they now feel safe to come back to the United States and rebuild their families and whatnot, re-enter U.S. society. But Ford did both of those things. He used a lot of pardon power. And ran for re-election in 76, and it was a very close election. He was defeated, and a lot of American voters said they voted against him specifically because he pardoned Nixon. A lot of Nixon's people who were doing this stuff went to jail. A huge amount of them went to jail for obstruction of justice and whatnot, served 2, 3, or 5 years. Even his personal attorney went to jail. Other questions? Yeah.
Okay, so they made the deal that if Nixon left office, he would pardon him. But I mean, wouldn't he have become president anyway?
Maybe. But from Ford's perspective, if this deal was struck, do you want to take the risk? I mean, if you have that opportunity to make a decision in the next half hour where you will either maybe get into the presidency if Nixon is declared guilty by the Senate, or guaranteed get into the presidency if you strike the deal. Yeah? You weigh your options. Who knows what the Senate would do in the next few months.